Do you know how it feels when you spend over 20 years saying you like Ocarina of Time? If you said that any time from its launch to the mid-2000s you'd hear well obviously it's the best game ever. And then, for the next several years you'd hear it's overrated, just play A Link to the Past, it's the same game but better. And now, if you say you like Ocarina of Time, you'll be greeted with it's too dated, just play Twilight Princess instead. Ocarina of Time cast such a wide shadow and it left an impression so big, nothing could live up to its praise, and it is very much a product of the late 90s. All those opinions are still appropriate, but I still think the game is often praised too much for its historic importance, or dismissed too much for the aspects that didn't age gracefully. The latter of which, in most cases, is remedied thanks to the 3DS remake, which has aged wonderfully if you ignore the fact that it was made for the 3DS, which has a tiny resolution and is underpowered, but it still did the best it could on that system. What I mean is, mechanically, this version has aged quite well, and the visual direction and style are still top notch. It's just the fidelity of the graphics are kind of unpleasant, to put it lightly. I first discovered Ocarina of Time on the N64 as a kid, but outside of novelty, I see no reason to ever revisit it there. It's a shame it's the go-to version whenever it's ported to new systems, because it isn't a great first impression to new players, and it isn't the magical return people would expect if they hadn't touched the game in 20 years. It is a slower mess with text that moves at a snail's pace, and a pause screen that's not any quicker. It has really stiff aiming which makes certain minigames tough, and the implementation of the iron boots in the original speaks for itself. None of this is helped by the fact that I have played the PAL version growing up, which is even slower in every aspect across the board. Now, there are advantages to the Nintendo 64 version, which I will bring up later, but barring very small things, it's not worth discussing or revisiting. Ocarina of Time 3D just made the original obsolete, which is a sign of how good a remake this is, especially when in comparison to the other N64 remakes on the 3DS. Like Star Fox, where I find it a slightly better experience, but it doesn't diminish the original, and both are still worth playing. Or we have Majora's Mask 3D, which ruined almost every aspect of the original game that made it what it was, but it has some small quality of life improvements, so I'm unhappy regardless of which version I play because I'll be missing something. Ocarina of Time isn't fixing what isn't broken, and it fixes what actually is. For the most part, it feels like only the right things changed, and everything else is exactly how it was, except prettier. We play as Link, some Hylian child living among the perpetually young Kokiri. No one knows he isn't one of them, and before puberty comes around and makes the situation awkward, the Great Deku Tree demands Link clean out his dying body that's full of parasites. Link is able to accomplish this, and thanks to the help of Navi, who is obviously a dead horse now, but back in the day, Ocarina of Time was a revolutionary title, which was the first to attempt or popularize a lot of concepts that we now take as second nature. Among other features, she is how we lock onto enemies, which gives us the iconic circling around the target. Very surprisingly, the L targeting here on the remake actually has an accessibility feature. We're talking about 2011 Nintendo here. We can choose between just holding or pressing the L button, which is a great feature, especially considering how small the shoulder buttons on the 3DS actually are. The downside of pressing instead of holding is that it can be trickier to just exit targeting. Sometimes the game interprets your pressing the button as you wanting to target a different enemy, but this is still a great feature for people that can't want to or don't want to hold in this tiny L button. If you use the L button when there are no enemies present, it does recenter the camera, because we don't have full camera control here. This is probably the only element of the game that does make it feel slightly dated. I wish it was updated after the new 3DS came out, since Majora's Mask has full camera control in its remake. In addition to aiming, Navi also helps prevent us from getting stuck, which was noble considering Zelda strategy guides made more money than some large countries. The problem with Navi is that she's too persistent and loves interrupting us. This is especially unpleasant on repeat playthroughs. Navi is a great assist, I just wish she was an optional assist. This is especially bad in the 3DS remake, which came out right when people were spending all their time online complaining about how much Navi ruined Ocarina of Time. It was a dead horse even then, but considering Skyward Sword was also coming out, I guess they didn't want to turn off the hits. Some hints you can turn off or well, just ignore, are these new Sheikah statues, and I really like them. If you're ever stuck trying to find something or just don't know how to progress the game and Navi isn't helping enough, just climb into one of these Sheikah statues and you'll get a short video showing you what to do. This is a genuinely nice feature, and to the people that find it too easy or casual, the people who would use this could just as easily use a guide. This is just another option for people, and it means they can get help without having to look up game facts. I love these being here, they're great little assists. The only thing I don't like about them is their placement. I mean, come on, stop bouncing like that, you're kind of ruining the atmosphere of a Temple of Time. This isn't the place for that. But with or without hand-holding, Link will make his way to Hyrule Castle after navigating this open field which was impressive 20 years ago, but let's face it, it is an empty chore now. He's been equipped with an ocarina which has many practical effects like changing the time of day, solving puzzles, and fast travel. One of the huge upgrades of this remake is the songs are on the bottom screen so you don't have to memorize the inputs, which is a nice feature because unlike some other Zelda titles, we have a different fast travel song for every single location we can travel to. I can't remember all these songs anymore, I'm getting too old. I've become too reliant on automation. In fact, the whole implementation of the ocarina is so much better in the 3DS remake. It does not take up one of your item slots. It has its own dedicated touchscreen button. While not as bad as, say, the original DX Link's Awakening, Ocarina of Time has an issue with constant item switching on the original release. We only had 3 item buttons, and since the ocarina is used constantly, it pretty much meant we only had 2 item buttons. Now we have 4, 2 physical and 2 touchscreen ones, which are fine for things like bottles, the Eye of Truth, and other items that aren't regularly switched to. And thanks to the ocarina having its own separated button, it's almost like having 5 item spaces. This is a huge time saver, and this is great convenience. After travelling the field slowly, so slowly, God, I wish we had the Pegasus boots or a functioning bunny hood or something. He has to meet with Princess Zelda by also navigating a tedious stealth section, and it's at this point you'd likely ask yourself if the game is actually good, because with the exception of Baby's first 3D dungeon, nothing has been fun. It's a good thing we meet Zelda and she introduces us to our quest, and she's here to instruct Link on how to have fun. This is when the game picks up and stops being a tedious relic, but a fun adventure. He initially has 2 more dungeons to complete, and these are both huge upgrades from the Deku Tree. We get to meet both the Goron and Zora, who were additions to the franchise I enjoy. This game is borrowing heavily from A Link to the Past and will become even more obvious shortly, but these new species help to show Ocarina still had some originality in it. And now Ocarina of Time knows how it feels to have everything stolen from it, because these are now series standards. During the childhood dungeons, one of the best features of the remake will still make itself very apparent. We have optional gyro aiming, and it's a blast. Ocarina of Time rarely required fast reaction times out of the first-person aiming, but this just helps speed it up without destroying the original setup. The only area where this becomes an almost essential feature instead of a nice convenience is during the target shooting minigames, which were really annoying stick only. After completing a few more dungeons, Link returns to Hyrule Castle, but it's too late, Zelda is already fleeing with Ganondorf moments behind them. Zelda does throw a fancy blue ocarina at Link's direction, and he picks it up and instantly forgets about the one that his friend gave him earlier. Link is assaulted by an adult and runs directly into the Temple of Time in the least efficient way possible just to watch a dude die. Link enters the temple, he stops existing for 7 years, someone pierces the ear of an unconscious kid, and we've now gone from the good part of the game to the really good part of the game. Link is dressing in his best version of the standard green tunic here, and chic is what happened to Zelda once he discovered Homestuck and testosterone injections. He's here to be a cool looking guy doing cool stuff. Honestly, everyone here is at their best. This is peak Link, peak Zelda, peak Ganondorf designs. I'm happy the designs keep changing, and I love the different art styles the series goes for later on, but this to me is the definitive look of everyone who matters. In particular in the 3DS version, which has models which match the official artwork set and show off the colourful cast to their full extent. And the whole world just feels better with this new art style. We even have small decorations everywhere, which make this world feel truly lived in. As in older teenage Link, we have to explore the same world we already saw, and now we get to see how it's been negatively impacted over the years. Hyrule Castle Town is the most obvious as it's been destroyed, and the only life here is whatever these scary things are. The rest of Hyrule isn't as effectively hurt, which I knew was due to practical reasons, for Nintendo 64 was not a miracle worker. But it does also make sense since the Hyrule Castle Town is so overly desolate as Ganondorf is set up as residence right next door. This is the closest town to him, which I could have seen being abandoned anyway for safety, even if he didn't corrupt the land with his dark magic. But he did corrupt the land with his dark magic, and he transformed this into something sinister. The rest of the world isn't hit as hard, with Zora being the only other ones that are this visibly impacted, unless you consider dark clouds being the worst thing imaginable. It's up to Link to save every isolated area that matters because that's what he does, and this game does follow a pretty standard template. There won't be many twists and turns to the formula, and the only genuine twist is something that Smash Bros. Spoiled over 20 years ago, which is pretty standard for that series. But what this game lacks in twists and turns, it more than makes up for in dungeon design. These are some of the finest, and more importantly, most varied dungeons in the series. We have a lot of them here, and while, say, Majora's Mask had better dungeons, it had far fewer of them. Wind Waker's dungeons didn't get good until the game was almost over, and Twilight Princess may have had fine dungeons, but they were all very samey. For better and worse, the dungeons don't feel the same here, even when aesthetically there are similarities. There is parity between child and adult dungeons thematically, like the Dongo's Cavern and the Fire Temple, the Bottom of the Well and the Shadow Temple, or the Spirit Temple and the Spirit Temple. The first 3 dungeons in this game are nice warm-ups that add complexity with each one. The first one was a great tutorial to vertical space in 3D, the second one was a bit more traditional, the third one had a lot of backtracking and we really had to think about it as a 3D space. But now that Link is mid-puberty, the complexity is cranked up even further. We have to worry about keys, which requires full exploration of our environments, and we have gimmicks here that are quite a bit more complex. For example, in the first dungeon, we have these switches that change the layout of areas, and we have a lot more block movement than we did previously. This first adult dungeon, the Forest Temple, is genuinely one of my favourites, but I do have some complaints with it, one being the time blocks here which just exist to impede us for like 3 seconds. They're all destroyed by playing a particular song in our ocarina. There's no puzzle here, it's no challenge, and this isn't a case of remembering something and backtracking later. We can't come here without that song. These blocks exist across the entire game and I dislike them in every case, but here the Forest Temple is what made me really start to hate them, so it gets the blame. There's a similar problem in this game with Zelda's Lullaby, but at least that feels less artificial than removing these time blocks. But that was a problem on the Nintendo 64 as well. A 3DS specific complaint, and one of the very few I actually have, is the atmosphere of the Forest Temple has been diminished. This remake is genuinely prettier and I do adore it, but some areas don't look as good when they're all pretty and colourful. The Forest Temple was creepy, it was dark, it was filled with fog, and this area had so much atmosphere. Darker locations like this don't look as good when they're this vibrant. This is also an issue for places like the Bottom of the Well, the Shadow Temple, and the end of the game. But those places still manage to have some atmosphere even if it's just been toned down a lot. The Forest Temple loses almost all of its mystique here. The Shadow Temple is still unmistakably creepy. I mean, it's full of scythes and skeletons and guillotines, and it's all dark and gritty. The vibe might have been toned down, and I doubt it would scare kids the same way it scared us 20 years ago, but it does still feel like a Shadow Temple. This doesn't feel like the same spooky Forest Temple of old. But like I said, while the game is worse looking in some isolated instances, it looks far better the rest of the time, and the problems are only problems if you directly compare them. In a vacuum, this still looks great. I just feel some of the direction was lost. The Fire Temples is still as great as it ever was as I attack fake doors and use a giant hammer. This is when we first get differently coloured tunics which aren't a stat modifier like earlier games. Instead, this red tunic lets us endure the heat, but more importantly it lets us look cool. This temple has a lot less of a focus on backtracking and spatial awareness, it is a bit more linear and it focuses on navigating a lot of floors, and it ends spectacularly by falling far enough that Link shouldn't be able to walk anymore. The most noticeable change here is the Fire Temple is using the modified music of later releases instead of the original Nintendo 64 version. Later cartridges and re-releases change some elements for censorship reasons, and I don't really mind. I'm fine with either track here or either mirror shield or whatever the changes are, for the most part. But if you hate change, then add this to the list of things you hate. But don't worry if you hate changes though, Link still does the spinny thing when doors open, that's not going away. Neither does the fact that all these dungeons trick me with chests that I think have small keys but it's just some rupees or consumable items I don't want. These annoyances are still left in the game because it would not be Ocarina of Time if I didn't have mood swings in a dungeon. Next up is the often forgotten Ice Cavern, which is a fun mini dungeon and a small obstacle between larger and more time consuming temples. I love this place, except for when you only have one bottle to play through like my most recent one. Bring at least 2 here unless you hate yourself. Bottles themselves are a nice way to modulate difficulty, as you can make the game as easy or hard as you wish depending on your usage of these glass containers. Go all in with fairies that revive you if you want some extra assistance, or just leave them empty if you just want to prove yourself to someone who cares. Other optional things you might want to consider are Epona the horse, which is surprisingly not required, and also the Biggoron sword, which is my favourite type of weapon. This is the strongest sword in the game by far, but it has a downside since it's two-handed. This means we can't dual wield a shield at the same time. It is a nice risk and reward, and it opens up the skill ceiling to people that can sidestep and dodge without requiring some metal to take the hit for them. The Water Temple is often hated, and I never really understood why it was so passionately despised. The original release was a lot more tedious, and I get not liking that. But the core design here is the best in the entire game. The fact is cemented in this re-release, which made the dungeon much more bearable, thanks to the lack of pace-breaking boot changing and better signposting with how and where you change the water level. The remake allows you to equip and remove boots with a simple button press like with any other item, whereas the original required you pausing the game, going to the gear option, changing your boots, going back out, and it's going so slowly and you have to keep doing this over and over, and sometimes you have to do it multiple times within a few seconds. These shouldn't have been toggled on and off so slowly in the first place, and I'm glad the devs realized it eventually. The issue was just the implementation of the boots, not the boots themselves. There is a lot more thinking about spatial awareness and seeing this as a believable place. You'll constantly be looping through the same central room as well, so it doesn't feel like any of the other dungeons. And because you're in the same central room, you'll never be too far away from anything else. This kind of complexity honestly feels like a Majora's Mask design for its dungeons, or even one of the Divine Beasts from Breath of the Wild, where your actions completely change the entire layout here. This is the best the game gets at dungeon design, but I do have one particular issue with it. The dungeon looks pretty samey, central hub room especially, but this is mitigated by looking at the map, which now takes up the entire bottom screen. So you'll know exactly where you're going at all times, and you don't have to worry about am I going north, south, east, or west. This map is great, and I'm glad it's always there, but it is pointless when you're not inside a dungeon. Anyway, after completing this hated dungeon, we get some changes to the formula actually, which keeps the game feeling fresh as adult Link fatigue could have possibly set in. The next 2 temples require we do part of the adventure as a child, so we get to experience Child Link without feeling like we're in training mode anymore. The bottom of a well is a Child Link dungeon that is smaller like the Ice Cavern, but it is a prerequisite for the Shadow Temple and it fits alongside it. And once we complete that, we go to the Shadow Temple as Adult Link, and they might have censored the blood, but don't worry, Link has come equipped with his blood-red tunic. After completing the Shadow Temple, Link assaults some women and we see an ad for Skyward Sword, and we move on to the Spirit Temple. This requires we complete half of it as Child Link and the other half as Adult Link, which is a concept I wish the game explored more. This emphasizes the fact that Ocarina of Time has great utility of its items. We don't have that many that are only used for a single dungeon and then ignored. We have fairly standard items here like Boomerang, Hookshot, and Bombs, which never go out of style in Zelda, and we get more interesting items like a stick, which are used throughout the entire Young Link portion of the game. Take that spinny wheel thing from Twilight Princess. And even more niche items like bomb shoes can still be used throughout if you feel like it. The mandatory items don't feel like filler and each one has a lot of uses. We do have a lot of filler here, but these aren't important dungeon items. These are entirely optional extras like masks, ice arrows, and Ferrari's wind just for example, and these are all for completionists. They don't overstay their welcome because they have no welcome, they're just kind of here, they're like an afterthought. The items feel better implemented in this remake. The hookshot now displays an icon if you can hook onto something. The gyroscope makes all aiming better, switching boots has never been so fun, and like I said, you can carry more items at any one time. There's been a lot of careful consideration here to make this feel as enjoyable as it could have been. After all that puzzle solving, we go to Ganondorf's castle, which has a hugely upgraded rainbow bridge in this remake, and then we do some more puzzles. God damn it, I thought we were at the end. After all of those, we get to fight Ganondorf, and it's a really fun moment here. We get to kill him with bottles, and then once he becomes the beast version of himself, he removes our one and only sword during battle, which is bad until I remember Link has a much larger sword in his back pocket. We kill Ganon, he bleeds green because of his censorship, and everything is happily ever after, except for the trauma everyone went through and the deaths of the innocents that will continue to persist in this timeline, even if Link goes back in time and stops Ganondorf before he does anything. We ended the revolution and reinstated the monarchy, who has absolute power again. Is this a happy ending? If the original game isn't exciting enough for you, the often ignored Master Quest is included in this 3DS re-release. We get the same dungeons, but with completely different interiors and puzzles. You'll take a lot more damage, and everything is mirrored, which does mess with muscle memory, but it's mainly there to annoy me whenever I use the first person view because that's not how it's meant to look. Master Quest isn't as fun, but it's a nice change of pace and I'm glad it's here as an option. Though it's only unlocked after completing the main quest, which is odd considering this is a remake of a game that everyone has already played before. Every Zelda game has a hook. Sometimes you're sailing the ocean, or you're changing seasons, but Ocarina of Time's hook isn't the Ocarina of Time, that's actually the hook of a sequel. Ocarina of Time's hook is just that it's so solid. Other games in this series do better in certain fields, but Ocarina of Time is the best all-rounder. It never wins gold, but it gets silver in every race, and that's gotta count for something. Either way you play Ocarina of Time, you're in for a joy, but if you stick with the original version, whether that be on Nintendo 64 itself, emulation, the GameCube re-release, the multiple eShop re-releases, or Nintendo Switch Online, just know that you're getting an inferior experience. I've seen a lot of people play this for the first time, say it sucks and then they give up quickly. The 3DS version isn't just prettier and better controlling, it's the one that hasn't aged as badly and it's the one that will hook new players. The original is fun, but it's fun to old people predominantly, and I'm the kind of person that finds Shenmue fun, so don't listen to me. If you have no tolerance for games that feel like they went past their expiration date decades ago, don't play the original. Ocarina 64 is the historic time capsule it is, and it's worth a revisit, but Ocarina 3D is the welcoming game for people with no attachment to the original, and it's the coziest way to come back to the original game if you haven't played it for quite some time. This is Nintendo's legacy, and should be experienced in the best way possible instead of the first way.